Okay, so we've set up our UI, and now we just want to actually just really think about what scripting actually means in Maya, right? Okay, so we can kind of see it already in a script editor. You guys might have something up here. I'm just going to go to Edit and clear the history up here. So I'm just going to have that completely blank. So the top area of our script editor should be completely blank. And so what that means is everything that I do from this point on is going to be represented here in code. Okay, so this is the output section of my script editor. Okay, so we don't have any buttons, but hopefully you're familiar enough with the gestural menu. So I'm just going to hold down Shift and right click and create a sphere. Okay, so I just created a sphere, right? And with some interesting, interesting settings there. But you can see that let's actually do that again. I'm just gonna delete clear the history again, but I'm gonna again Shift right click, create a sphere, and you can see that what happened was you can see the output here that something happened and it was called polysphere. Right? So the output of me pressing that button, which is exactly the same as if you pressed the one of the primitive buttons that you have up in your shelf, what actually happened was it ran this line of code. So it ran this line of code that created a sphere for us. Okay, so everything that I do in Maya, everything that I do interacting with the GUI, the graphical user interface, actually runs a line of code in MEL, or at least gives me something that I have access to, right? So I have access to all the kind of surface level aspects of Maya through code. And again, that is when I press buttons, it's running a line of what might seem like gobbledygook right now, but actually is something quite important that we can actually change ourselves, right? So creating the polysphere or creating the sphere ran this line of code up here, right? So this is the output up here, and down in this bottom half of my script editor, that's the input, or at least that is where we can type our own code so we can run it in Maya. So you might see in yours, you might actually see a couple of tabs here, or maybe you've got multiple tabs that you've actually added code to yourself. But the name on the tab actually is very important. So it's the coding language that you are going to be writing in. Okay, so you can see MEL or Python. Those are the two options we have in Maya. Different kinds of code that we can write. But we're just going to ignore Python for now, or at least we're not worrying about Python. Python is, has more access, has some access to API, which might not make any sense right now. But MEL is, is the language we're going to be working with. Okay, so we're going to be working in tabs that have the MEL above it. And MEL just means Maya Expression Language. Okay, so everything in this output out here is actually representation of what is being, or the code being run in MEL. Right, so that means I can actually write code in here in MEL, and that will actually run certain things in the program, right? So me pressing that button before, or yeah, me creating that sphere, you can see again, I just made a sphere. It ran a line of code. If I copy that line of code from my output into my MEL tab down here, you can see that MEL, or at least it knows what this command was. So it knows that there was a polysphere command written, that was run. Okay. So what we can do is we can use all the commands from the GUI, everything, and we can actually use them and write them in our own way. This is kind of why we want to use scripting. We don't just want to be using these buttons and having to go through all this rigmarole sometimes of, I don't know, just finding a lot of, like adding things manually. We want to be able to write some code and some more complex things to be able to do or make the program work for us, right? If we want to create 100 if we're going to create 100 spheres, I can go 100 and then go, I can duplicate. It might be quick and I might be able to, Shift D and duplicate them across, whatever, and keep going and keep going, keep going, keep going, and use my hotkeys, and that kind of works pretty well, doesn't it? But I might want to just be able to do that in one click or in one hit, one use of code, and just duplicating a sphere is very simple compared to what we will be able to do with code. Okay. So anyway, everything that we do and the buttons we press create a line of code, or will be displayed as a line of code here. Let's have a look at another one. So just create a plane. So you can see polyplane. I'm just going to copy that down into my MEL script tab down here. So the way that we now use this when we've written some code down here is we highlight it, and with the numpad, hopefully you have a numpad on your keyboard, but if you don't, so you either press numpad on your keyboard or you press Control Enter, right? So it's either Control Return, so the big Enter button in the middle, or if you have a numpad, just press the numpad Enter. And so what that does is it runs the code that you have highlighted. Okay, so you can see that I copied the code that was run when I pressed the button for Polysphere. I copied it down here into my script, and now I've highlighted that, and when I highlight it and press numpad enter, it runs that code for me again. So it does exactly the same thing, but it does it when I want it to. Right, I'm not pressing any button, whatever. I'm doing it. So it's pretty much I'm recreating the button press, but I'm doing it through code. Okay, and I can do the same for my polyplane because I have replicated the code that was run when I pressed the button. I highlight that polyplane and I press enter on my numpad, and you can see it's now created my plane. Should change my background color to make it more obvious, but either way, that's how it works, right? So just the basic anatomy of this code here is quite an important thing to realize, right? So you can see that MEL and Maya is coloring this for us quite nicely, right? So it understands that polysphere is a command that is able to be run by MEL, right? So in my MEL tab, I can write this command and it understands, that's why it gives it the color. It understands that this is something that it does, or it can interpret, or it can run. Now, so I just got rid of that second line because I don't really want to need it, or need them. So everything after it is just, or are just different ways that it is telling this command, or different things that it is telling this command to do, right? So if we have a look at what this command is, it's polysphere. We kind of know already what the important things are for a polysphere, right? So if I'm just going to press shift, right click, get my sphere option box up, so my options menu, and let's have a look at the important things that Maya is asking us for when we create a polysphere. It's asking us for a radius. So let's actually just make these simple. Radius of 2, and make these axes equal now. So I'm just going 10 and 10. Okay, so these are just the basic settings that I have, but Maya is asking me for those numbers, right? So we go apply. So we can see what kind of polygonal sphere I just created. It has a radius of 2, and axes along its, or at least, sorry, subdivisions along its axis, and along its height. It has 10 and 10. Let's have a look at the code. So I'm just going to copy it across. Now let's just, I'm going to copy it over my other code down here. Let's have a look. So we've got polysphere, so it's running the code, polysphere. Let's have a look. What numbers do we need to know? I set the radius of 2, didn't I? Then I set the subdivision along the axis at 10. Then I set the subdivision of the height at 10. And these other things we can talk about. We don't need to talk about now. Those were all the other settings that I could have changed within the dialog box. But if we can now, seeing as though they're all numbers here, those are numbers I can change, right? I can just put anything in there I want. Now we can actually do them ourselves without opening the option box, right? So before we do that, we need to kind of understand what these things are. Okay, so just the anatomy of this is that this is a command. So something is being run. Okay, so the command is polysphere. So polysphere has different things you can change about it, right? So polysphere wants to be a certain way, so it has a certain default. So let's actually have a look at that, right? So if I, well, this is actually important about syntax, but we end lines with semicolon, but this will come up a lot. But all I'm doing is I'm running the command with nothing after it. So remember, the way we do that is just highlight. So I'm just running the command. Okay. So what I'm doing is I'm running this command with all of its basic or default inputs, right? So that just means that everything that is default about this command here just gets run when I just do that, right? If I want to change any of those things, as you saw when we changed those settings in the option box, we actually have to give it more information and we have to tell it what that information is, right? So we do that through things called flags. Okay, so depending on your level of code and just general knowledge about code, you will have come across, or you might not have come across, flags or even commands. I mean, completely fine. But flags are the way in which we tell a certain command to do something slightly different than what it was originally going to do. Okay, so we can see here that there's a flag. Everything in MEL and the syntax for flags in MEL are a dash and then the acronym, or at least just the representation of what that flag is. So the way that we can use this, and especially in Maya, which is really, really useful, is we see that there's a command here and we might want to see what all the different flags are for that command. So if we double click on the command, right click on it, and then we can go down here to quick help. So you can see to the right hand side, it's now given us a list of things that they look quite similar to these dashes. So these are all the flags that we can use when we use this command. Okay, so if we want to actually decipher, sometimes we actually just want to decipher. That might not be as easy as R, or maybe we don't even know what R is. Let's have a look at what R means. So we've got this flag. We can see dash R. Let's have a look for dash R. Dash R is radius, right? So the radius, then, we can see that we have dash R, radius, and it has a space bar, and then it has length, right? So what that means is we can define, or we can set a flag, which is dash R, and then this is telling us what value should come after it, or what kind of data, what data type should come after it. We'll go into, maybe next lesson or the lesson after, we'll go into data types, but either way, we can see that we can set the flag. So that is, remember, it's the dash, then the number that we can see here. And then we can see a space bar, and then the value, or the number in this case, that we're going to set that flag to. Okay, so this is a radius, so we can set to any number we want, can't we? So let's change this to just 10. Okay, so what's going to happen? This means that we're going to have we're going to create a polysphere with a radius of 10. Oh, let's make it 10.2 blah blah blah. Right, so I can make that a float, or we'll go into floats later, but I can make that a number of complexity that it doesn't matter. So just random complexity given that. Okay. Now, let's break down the rest of it. So we've got SX here. Let's find out what SX is rather. That's subdivisions in the X. And what that takes in is an int. Okay, so the data type that we can see coming after this is an int. And an int is an integer. So that's it's a counting number, right? So 1, 2, 3, 4. All those numbers that are whole numbers, that is what we're looking for, okay? So that's what an int is. The length that we had radius is actually a float. So that just means that it's got decimals. It's kind of a fraction. It's a decimal. It's got multiple levels with which we can actually determine this number. Whereas an integer, where you can see, again, this float takes an int. That is integer. That just means it's a whole number. Okay, so I'm going to change this as well. So subdivisions along the x-axis, I'll just make that 2. Oh, actually 2 for a sphere. No, I'll make that 3. Right, and let's go down. We can continue along. So sy is subdivisions in the y. So that's 3 now. Let's actually up that. So I'm changing my subdivisions of the x to 3, subdivisions in the y to 50. So let's actually get rid of this next one. We don't really need to worry about the axis. That's just, yeah, actually you guys would know about the axes, but either way, that's just y is up. So that's just the axis it's pointing for my gimbal and my manipulators and things. Anyway, I'm just going to get rid of it. And what's the next one? Create UVs. Do I want to create UVs? No, I don't. Oh, what kind of UVs do I want to create? Don't need to worry about that. So again, this is us actually fixing or just making something even simpler. So you saw how, like, when we pressed the button, it created like non-default things for when we wanted them to be quite default. Okay, so my construction history. So whenever you create something, you know that there's a history there. I don't want a history at all. So you can see construction history on or off. It's currently set to on. So 1 is on. 1 is yes. 1 is true. These are booleans. We'll go into data types again. But I want to actually turn that off. So it's currently set to 1, which is 1. I'm going to set to 0. Okay, so let's have a look. We've got polysphere with a flag for radius. I'm saying the radius. Got a flag for the subdivisions along x. It's got a flag for the subdivisions along y. And it's got a flag for whether or not it's going to be created with a construction history. And I've told it not to, right? And so let's see what happens. Bam. So you can see, this is quite a weird circle, but it's created this shape or this circle with a radius of 10 point blah, blah, blah. You can see that it's got subdivisions, that's got 3 subdivisions there. And you can also see that it's got 50 subdivisions going up and down. And if we look at our attribute editor, it's got no history. It's got no node that is telling us how it created it, which is actually very useful later on. But maybe we let's just turn our construction history back to 1. So that means it's going to give us the construction history, and I'm going to do it again. So I've got to my attribute editor. You can see that my history is here. And now we can actually see the attributes that I changed, or the flags that I changed. We can see it much more easily. So the radius being 10.2, subdivisions being 3, subdivisions being 50. So I set that all through code. Okay. So the last flag, and kind of very important one, is the name. Okay. So it's the only one you don't really have access to when you're pressing a button to create an object or a primitive. What we want to do a lot of the time is actually, of course, when we create the object, we want to name it as we create it. So we have way more access to that when we code than we do when we just click buttons in the GUI. So you can see here that we have a flag called name. And so what am I going to do? I'm going to go -n. You can see that there's the flag here, -n. And then there's a different data type than we've had before. Remember, an int is a whole number. The length is actually a float, which means decimal, kind of a large number that has, or not necessarily a large number, but a number with all kinds of increments. And a string is actually just a collection of characters, right? So it's not a number, not anything else. What it is, it's like a string of characters that kind of go together. So what that just means is I can type words in here and they will be words. They're not going to try to be numbers. It's not trying to be anything fancy. It is just literally I type out what I want and it will be there as a string. And we'll go into that a little bit more detail later, but I mean, that's pretty much what it is, right? So the way we type out a string is we put quotation marks and we type out whatever we want, right? So for me, it's going to be geosphere 01, right? So that's boring. But what it means is this command is going to run. It's going to create a sphere with radius of 10.2, something, whatever, with the axes and the subdivisions of 3 on the x-axis, subdivisions of 50 along the y. I'm going to change my history back to 0 because I don't want my history. It's also going to name it. So I'm telling it what it's going to name, right? So when I run this, what's going to happen? Bam. I have a sphere, which doesn't look like a sphere, but I've got an object that is created from a sphere that is called Geosphere 01, and it has all these different attributes because I've defined or at least told this command what to do with the flags. And that's just the really basic aspects of the anatomy of a command. And that's kind of where we'll continue to work, right? So we're always going to be, or at least a lot of the time, we're going to be working with specific commands that do different things. And with each individual command, they're all going to have individual flags. So it's really kind of important to understand that syntax and how we continue to kind of use those different little aspects of different commands. Okay? And that's the next one. I'll do something. Not sure what I'm going to do for the next lesson, but let's go. Yeah, talk to you then.